This is the Disrupt Your Career podcast, episode 2. We aim to bring you news and ideas from other thinkers in the career management field and to make this provocative and open to debate from you. Our work is about real people in radical career transitions, and we can only be accurate and up to date if we know your stories too. Our guest today is Jennifer Petriglieri, INSEAD Professor of Organisational Behaviour. Earlier in the summer, we had the immense good fortune to spend some time talking to the wonderful Jennifer about her book, which is published this autumn and goes by the name of Couples That Work. We wanted to talk to her not only about her book, but about the crossover points between her work and ours. We talk about career breaks and how to survive them, about who gets the power in deciding how to share out career priorities, and about the importance of contracting in a couple. A video and transcript of the interview can be found on our website, www.disrupt-your-career.com. And we hope you will sign up for extra insight from our newsletters there too. And now, over to Jennifer. We hope you enjoy this interview and look forward to your comments. Why did you choose to write this book? What's kept you going through the subject and the process and everything else?
Yeah, it's a great question, a question I ask myself sometimes. No, for the past 10, 15 years, I've really been researching career development and leadership development. And I really found this pattern that as I spoke to someone, tell me about your career journey, they would say, if you really want to understand my career journey, you need to understand my partners as well. And it kind of piqued my interest, and I heard it enough times. I thought, there's something in here. And, as every good academic does, I went to the library and found just nothing out there. And what's interesting is this was a time when the social narrative was really shifting. So it was the time when Marianne Slaughter and Sheryl Sandberg were coming, really reaching the fore in terms of the narrative in America. And the thing that both women said, obviously from very different angles, was the most important career decision you make is who you marry. Now, there's something a little bit icky and transactional about that, but it resonates with a lot of us, right? And so I was saying, it feels true, but is there any evidence that's true? And the answer was no. And of course, as an academic, that's great because it means there's a wide open playing field for me to walk into. And being in a dual career couple myself, was like, okay, this is personally interesting, and it's obviously a huge need for rigorous research because there's nothing out there. So it really started with a very academic research project, which, I published academic papers, and then eventually it sort of became, the book, the more and more data I collected. Because of course, as you know, writing an academic paper, you have to pick a little piece of the puzzle. And I wanted to write the full story, and that's how the book was born.
You interviewed about 150 couples from all over the world and ended telling 30 or so stories in the book. Did you notice differences or trends relating to dual careers?
Surprisingly few, actually. And I think there's what I sometimes think of this iceberg metaphor, right? What you see on the surface can look quite different, but the dynamics underneath are rather universal. And careful using that word, right? There's nothing that's completely universal. But when we look underneath those real dynamics around the power sharing in the couple and whose career takes priority really cut across. Now, obviously, we see some cultural differences. For example, in some countries of the world, some Asian countries, some Middle Eastern, some African countries, it's very normal for grandparents to do a lot of childcare duty, which takes the pressure off the parents. So we see regional dynamics like this, which can either increase the pressure or decrease the pressure for dual career couples. But those fundamental relational dynamics were really very similar across ages, across races, religions, whether it was a gay couple, a straight couple. They were very, very similar dynamics underneath.
What can you tell us about the notion of dual career couples today across the world?
Yeah, so it's interesting because if you rewind to the 1970s, the term didn't even exist. And the first writings on it called it a deviant professional lifestyle. Yeah, imagine now. And fast forward to today, and if we look at North America, the West, more than 2/3 of professionals are in dual career couples who are in a couple. So it's the norm. It's no longer deviant, it's the norm. Now, obviously, those proportions differ a little bit, by country. And they differ by generation. So if we look to the under 40s, under 45s, that's a much higher proportion than the older generation. So we see with each generation that comes through, that proportion grows. And there's a really interesting question, why, right? And I think there's a few reasons. One is economics, quite frankly. You know, jobs are not as stable, there's not as uncertainty, so you're hedging your risks if you both work. I also think really our sense of what makes a meaningful life has changed. And many, many people, not all, for good or for bad, see work as a very integral, meaningful piece of their lives. And so the idea that one partner would give up on that just doesn't sit well with people. Want both pieces of the pie. Likewise, what's really interesting when we look at the data is, although we tend to think stereotypically that women want to do the childcare, if you look at the younger generations, it's really very equal in terms of people's desire to spend time with children and kind of be at home. So there's a balancing out we can see across the generations. And it's not going away.
One of the things we looked at in our book was the taking of breaks and the return after the breaks. Did you discover anything particularly significant about the way couples decide who's going to take the longer break, how it's going to be portioned out, and what the challenges are for either gender returning?
Yeah, so I think there's two kinds of breaks. There's parental breaks or some kind of family break, and then there's career breaks to retrain, etc. And I see those as quite different. Yeah. So obviously the parental break, it's still majority women doing this, although that is changing quite rapidly, but it's still majority women. And I mean, there's a lot of data around this. We know that if a woman takes more than 2 years out, it is extremely difficult to get back in. And that, you know, is borne out in my data. And I think, you know, what I saw in my data was very often couples didn't quite understand that when they got into that situation and then regretted it later. Or they were making that choice based on a sort of financial calculation without thinking of the long-term finances. So right now, a lot of my salary is going on childcare, so it doesn't make sense, without thinking that, in fact, in the future, that will, you know, the cumulative interest, if you like, on your career going forward. So I think that's very specific for parental breaks. I think what's interesting is the career breaks to retrain. And if we think our careers are expanding in time, you know, it's most of us are not going to retire at 60, 65 anymore. We're going to go on working. And if we think we have a 40, 50-year career span, no one is going to be in the same job all the way through. So all of us need to take time to retrain, to reorient. And what I found there was really interesting, because one of the things that being in a dual career couple buys you is the opportunity to do that. You know, and there's this sense a little bit of turn taking. You know, you're going to take time right now to reorient, and then it's your turn, and then we'll flip back. And I think that's one of the huge advantages, you know, right now for dual career couples, that they can take that time. And what I also found, that one person's time out and reorientation would often spark the next. So it wasn't an isolated, you do this, then I do mine. It was you do this, but then that sparks me doing my own and pushes me further. So there was very much a cyclical dynamic going on between the couples.
From your research, you found that there were 3 main models of contracting in the couple. Amazingly, one model seems to work better than the others. Would you mind elaborating on these 3 models and the insights derived from them?
Yeah, so traditionally when we think of dual career couples, we think of primary and secondary. Who has the primary career and who has the secondary? And often when we read in the press or people hear lectures, they'll say you need to choose who's going to take the primary and secondary. And of course, traditionally it was usually the man who took the primary and the woman who took the secondary. But there's 2 other models that people are using. One is a turn-taking model, where we take turns in the primary position and then flip. And the other is what I call a double primary, which is we're both going to really push our careers, but we'll have some boundaries set around it. Maybe we'll just live in Paris, or no one's going to travel more than a certain percentage of time. Some boundaries to enable that to happen. And on the surface, when you look at those 2 models, you think, well, the third is really very difficult. But what I found was people who did the third were, on average, obviously there were people happy in the other boxes, but more satisfied with their careers and with their relationships. And the question is why? Because on the surface you look at it and think, that's a little bit odd, because that feels very, very stressful. And what I found was it actually wasn't the model at all that was leading to that. What it was leading to was, because they had the boundaries in place, they had to have very explicit conversations around what the model is. And when I looked at couples in the other two models who were also very successful, they were couples who'd had those explicit conversations. The problem with the other two models is you can fall into them without necessarily having to have the conversations. So the secret sauce, if you like, is the conversations. It's not the model itself, which I think is really good news, because, you know, it's so annoying when we're told by academics and practitioners like us, this is the one thing you need to do. It's just impossible that one thing can work for, you know, across the board. And I think what my research shows is actually any model can work as long as it's been explicitly negotiated. So it's, if you like, it's the process you take, which is vital, as opposed to the thing you pick. What's interesting is when you talk to couples, and I interviewed people separately, is many couples thought they had an agreement, but when I spoke to the other half, the agreement was quite different. And so it's about being very explicit about what is the agreement.
Would you mind sharing your story of when your then future husband met you in Italy with the notebook and made you start that process very early on?
Like many couples in our late 20s, early 30s, we'd had plenty of other relationships, let's put it that way. And I think when we got together, we were like, okay, we're going to do this differently. And really from the get-go, we sat down and it's very romantic because it's on a Sicilian beach, which always feels extremely romantic, and it is, with a notepad and pen, and just spend some time on our own writing. You know, what do we really want out of this relationship, and what are some of the things we're worried might happen? And then having a conversation around that. And we actually still have the piece of paper, which is quite cute. But that for us sparked really, I mean, our lifetime of conversations around these things. But it wasn't around, you know, we want 2 kids and we want to do this. It was more the fundamental, like, what are our values in life? What do we really want out of life? Who do we want to become? And I think, you know, what happens is, you know, a lot of people say communication is the key to relationships. Yes, but it matters what you talk about. And I think a lot of couples communicate a lot, but not necessarily about the things that really matter. You know, they'll be talking about who picks the kids up and, you know, this practical day-to-day stuff, which of course are important. We need to talk about those. But they're missing that deeper layer of what do we really want? What direction are we going in? You know, what are we doing here?
How would you explain the 3 transitions to someone who doesn't have time to read the book or wants a quick cheat sheet? And do they always happen in sequence?
So, you know, as I spoke about before, what I was really interested in the book is of course, the practical things matter, but really what's going on underneath the relationship. And what I found was these dynamics, it's not like couples are dealing with them all the time, right? Sometimes they're a bit more in the background and sometimes they come to the fore. And when they come to the fore is relatively predictable. And what I found that there was really 3 key times they became very salient and couples had to deal with them. And this is what I call in the book the 3 transitions. So the first one, to your question, does it always? The first one always occurs whenever we couple, whether we couple at 18 or 88. And the first transition usually happens in the first 5-ish years of our relationship. I think as we get older, it tends to happen sooner because we have more complex lives to fit together. Maybe if we're younger and carefree, it may take a little bit longer. But the first transition is really all about how do we make these 2 independent lives we have interdependent, in a nutshell. And so whatever stage at life we are, whether we're like me now, mid-40s, and maybe we're coming out of a marriage and we've got kids and careers and very complex, or whether we're, you know, the kids have left home and we're later in life, or whether we're early 20s, mid-20s and things are very carefree, we still, whenever we come into a new relationship, we of course have very independent lives. And to really become a couple, those need to become interdependent. And I use that word very carefully because it's not about having a merged life. It's not about having one life, but it's also not about simply making the paths go in parallel. There needs to be some interdependence such that mine reinforces yours and yours reinforces mine. So very often the first transition is triggered by some event. So for example, if we think of the younger couples who have quite carefree lives often, it tends to be triggered by perhaps the arrival of a first child, which, we've got to sort things out then. Maybe it's a big career transition like the ones you talk about in your book in terms of a geographic move opportunity or something that really needs to rethink. I think the reason the first transition happens sooner in couples who are a bit older when they get together is we have more complex lives. So very soon we bump into an event that, crikey, we need to sort this out. And so, but it's not about the event itself. The event is just the trigger that makes us realize, okay, we cannot, if we want to really be a couple, carry on these two independent paths. And so the first transition is all about negotiating that interdependent path. And of course, the thing couples often get wrong is to do that at the practical level, right? How do we figure out our schedules? How do we figure out chores around the house and things? Now, let me be clear, those things are important, but they're not the thing that's going to get you through the transition successfully. It's about the career prioritization we've just been talking about. What's our commitment? What are our boundaries? Are there, geographic zones which are out, which are in? All these conversations need to happen there to really give us a path we can walk on together. So that's the first transition. And again, that happens for every couple. The second transition is really linked to a life stage, which has become known as the midlife crisis. And what's interesting in that is when it was first called crisis by Carl Jung and others, it was meant in a very positive way because it's a time of huge developmental growth. And so it's not a set age, but it tends to happen somewhere around our late 30s to late 40s, roughly. But again, for some people it happens a bit early, for some later. So it's not an exact time. So all couples go through the first transition. If couples are together in that period, they will also go through the second transition. And what's interesting is couples who get together in that period often go through the two transitions rather close together. They sort themselves out and at the same time as really figuring out. And that second transition is very much about, okay, what do we really want from life? Because what we find with, and all of us did this, it's easy for those of us who are past this stage now to roll our eyes, but in our 20s and 30s, most of us are on some kind of train. We've got onto a track, we're motoring along it, we're trying to grow our careers, we're maybe having children, there's one thing after the other. And then there tends to get a point sometime around our late 30s to late 40s where we stop and think, why am I really doing this? Now, there's a lot being written on that individually, but what I write about in the second transition is what does that do to a couple? Because, of course, when you have two people with careers, there's two people going through this at the same time and really reconsidering what they want out of life. And, of course, that has a knock-on effect to their relationship because often what enables our career is our relationship. And if we want that career to shift, there needs to be a shift in the relationship to support that transition to what I call a more individuated path. And what I mean by that is a path which just feels more mine. It's not that I became an engineer because that's what smart kids do in my country, or, my mum did this, so I'm going to do that as well. It's really, what's the path I really want to be on? And so there's a lot of quite difficult dynamics to deal with in a couple at this time. And it's interesting because if you actually track the divorce statistics, of course, it's not a linear curve. We know there are peaks and troughs. And this does tend to be a big peak time for divorces. And I think it's no surprise because it's a time when we're really rethinking our lives holistically, not just our careers. And the question is...
Not necessarily in sync.
And not necessarily in sync. And the question is, can we manage that together? And so one of the things I talk about in the book, for example, is the importance of how we can support each other's development in that, and how couples who do well through that transition are couples who can really tolerate the anxiety of not knowing. The anxiety of, well, can you not just decide what you want to do and tell me and then we go for it? And really fully support each other to take that time to explore and grow and develop and then shift direction. So that's the second transition. The third transition, again, is a little bit more linked to life stage, although it's a broad sweep. And it tends to happen when we get to that point where we feel somehow more senior. And it's a time with lots of role changes. So it could be in the personal life, maybe our children leave home and we take a different role socially. Often that also coincides with work, that we become we're no longer the bright young things, we're no longer on the high potential lists, where people are coming to us for mentoring and support, and we're seen as the éminence grise if I can put it that way. And it sparks a lot of questionings, really quite deep identity questions around, okay, who am I now? What about my legacy? I still may have a good time in my career to make a change, but if I want to do something, the time is now. There's a bit more of a sense of urgency at that stage. Okay, I've maybe got one chance left to do a major reshift. What's it going to be? And at that time, people's horizons tend to broaden. So even in the second transition, people still tend to be focused on career plus family. That's it. But when we get to that third transition, it tends to be quite a bit broader. So it might be, yes, career and family, but it's also about my personal interests and pursuits. It might be very often about giving back to the community. It's a time when people maybe take on side projects. It might be small projects like, being on the board of a not-for-profit, for example. It could be some volunteer work. So it tends to be a time when our horizons broaden, and we can really go for a much more holistic reinvention than in our earlier years when, let's face it, we have a lot of responsibilities, big mortgage, kids, etc., big teams to manage. And so the third transition is really at a deeper level still than the first two transitions, which is this identity level. And what's interesting is more and more frequently, we see that dual career couples at that stage are starting to do things together. And so this is a stage when maybe not all of their jobs, but some start little businesses together, others have side projects together. So what's interesting at this stage is there is a trend when some couples' paths meet and touch at some points in this, or they have some side projects together. So that's really an identity transition.
Maybe now we should turn to organizations. Do you see companies that do great work to encourage and support dual careers?
Not many. If I'm honest, not many. So I think let's come back to the issue first to understand it. So the issue is that almost all organizations' talent management processes, even if they're a new organization like a Google or a Facebook, one of the tech organizations, which are young organizations, they're very much based on the logic of what sociologists call the ideal worker. And I'd say ideal, which is a guy who has a stay-at-home wife who takes care of everything, so they can dedicate themselves 100% to work. Now, companies will deny this, but if you look at the talent management and processes, there are these kind of lockstep rotations where I'm going to send you to China for 3 years and then you're going to go here for 3 years. So very lockstep transitions. There tend to be quite rigid paths to the top. So for example, our current CEO did this, so if you want to get to the top, that's the way you get to the top. There's also this real irony at the moment in that we live in a world where we could all flexi work. There is the technologies and things of never before, and yet we're in a world where we do more FaceTime in the office than ever before. And so there's a stigmatization of flexible working. So even though we could and we're enabled to do that, and in fact we know the productivity benefits are extremely high, it's stigmatized. And so these two problems are combining to make a lot of inertia in organizations. So even organizations who seem quite dedicated, because this logic runs deep underneath the talent management systems, they're changing things around the organization. So I'm sure organizations will have amazing flexible work policies, but if you take them, you're passed over for promotion. And I think when I talk flexible work, I'm not talking working 2 days a week or something. I'm talking, working from home a little bit of time. But again, it's a career killer. And so, organizations are pretty stuck at the moment because they can't get past this logic. And I think this is more about a cultural shift than about processes and procedures. Because in many cases, the processes and procedures are there. Absolutely. They're just not being used. And I think that's the problem. And I think... And what we see is, rather than whole organizations having cracked this, there's microclimates within organizations. And it tends to be where the head is also in a dual career couple. So they get it, if I can put it that way. And it's really interesting because it mirrors, so there's a lovely paper out there that looks at biases among senior male managers. And of course, the least biased senior male managers are those with partners who work, or with daughters who work. And it's because they understand it through their skin, right? If we haven't lived it, it's very hard to understand. And this is where I think the shift in generations will help us, because the reality is that many of those people in the older generations in organisations right now haven't lived that life. And so how can they understand it? I mean, it's a big ask to ask them to really understand what this means. So hopefully there's, that will change as the generations go through.
Do you see organizations looking for help in this area? Is there any proactive demand for this, either to you or to others?
Yeah, so I think you're beginning to see this with the real progressive organizations. So I think things like the consultancies, the organizations which take in a lot of high level talent, if I can put it like this. The people who are at the cutting edge are really getting onto this, but I think this is really the frontier of talent management at the moment. So for example, I was speaking to one of the big consultancies just earlier this week, and they're saying they've identified this as the next thing they need to crack. And what we usually see is those organizations tend to be the vanguard, right? And then the others will follow. So I think what's important for organizations to recognize is there's been a lot of focus on women in business, as we know, over the last few years, which is needed and very important. But dual career couples is about all talent. And what people really don't recognise is our marriage patterns have changed. And so if you rewind, there's this lovely study around the distance between the two partners' parents' houses when they get married. And 40, 50 years ago, it was less than a mile. You married the boy next door or the girl next door, okay? Now, obviously it depends by country, but it's more than 60 miles. So we don't like the boy next door anymore. So who do we like? Essentially what's happening is something sociologists call assortative mating, which is an awful term, but it means that we are pairing with someone who is extremely close to us on educational level, potential, and also ambition level. So whereas before you would see the doctor marry the nurse or the PhD marry that never happens anymore. You get the really high level talent marrying the really high level talent. And I think it's companies like the consultancies who are hiring that talent who are really starting to realize this because they feel the pinch. And I think the other organizations are a bit slower because 20, 30 years ago, if you hire a high talent, the odds are their partner may not be or may have a job. Right now, if you hire a high talent, you want to bet their spouse is just as high, if not even higher talent than they are. And I think that's a really big change in the sociological makeup of society, which I don't think a lot of organizations have really cottoned on to yet.
It's a big opportunity then.
I think it is a big opportunity. And what you see is, of course, these highly talented people can vote with their feet. And so I think at the moment that there's a lot of power in, if you like, the supplier of talent. And I also think what's interesting is it's not a gender dynamic. So I spoke to a very senior woman in a big pharmaceutical company a couple of weeks ago, and she was late 30s and she was getting married for the first time. So she was already very senior in her career. And her husband to be is in the IT industry, also extremely senior. But her colleagues, didn't know much about him, and they just made the assumption that he would move for her. So I don't think it's no longer an assumption. It's not so much an assumption about the gendered aspect. It's the assumption that if you're high talent, obviously you have a stay-at-home partner, whether you're male or female. So, yeah.
As we look into the future of the world of work and all the trends that we're aware of, including AI and machine learning, things will completely change. How do you foresee dual career couples evolving over time?
So, I mean, if current trends are anything to go by, it's already the norm. It's going to become more and more prevalent. So certainly it's not something that's going away. It's something that will, increase as time goes on. I think in terms of, the new world of work, it's difficult to predict entirely how this will change it, because on the one hand, the new world of work should enable us to work more flexibly, so should make it easier. But we know that it's not. So the sort of logic is not bearing out in the marketplace. And so it's really difficult to see what will happen. So even jobs which could be done 100% of the time from home, which I don't think is a healthy thing, I think we need those interactions, we know that's not happening at all. And so it's a very interesting situation, because while potentially and logically things should be made easier, the world of work actually seems to be pulling in the opposite direction from the underlying technological trends. So I will be very interested to find out what happens.
Would you see the so-called Gen Z as having different expectations, different values, different purposes in their work and personal life?
It's difficult. I think there's a lot being made about how different they are, but when you talk to demographers, there's a lot less difference than is hyped, I think. I think they are less willing to put up with things that perhaps our generations did. They're less willing to just put the hours in. But I also think they can be very committed to work and things. So it's hard to say, but I think they're perhaps more likely to vote with their feet, if things are not working out. And certainly the level of dual career couples in that generation will be higher than ever before.
You told us that the people you interviewed didn't want to have their real names used. They wanted to be anonymized. That raises a question, which is about, philosophically, if we don't learn to share more openly about these kinds of intimate things, if we don't allow ourselves to be named or shown, what does that say to our ability to evolve?
Yeah, so I think we need to separate out academic research, because so anonymity is a norm of academic research. Mm-hmm. So okay. I would be careful to extrapolate the fact that it doesn't reflect the expectations. Okay. However, let me say something, is that whenever I present my work, people come to me afterwards and say, I thought I was the only one. And so I do think there is something to your question in terms of it's not that talked about. And I think the reason it's not is in our society right now, we have something which we've never had in the past, which is this sense that love and work are very separate. And so it's okay to talk about struggles at work, and it's okay to talk about struggles with the kids or whatever, at home. But the intersection, people just don't talk about it. Now, and what's interesting is I always ask people, why? Why did you think about it? And oftentimes they just say, well, I guess I just thought no one else struggled with it. So I think part of it is, I'm not sure it's about embarrassment. Maybe it is in some cases, and it is quite intimate, right? Your relationship with your partner and things. But I think a lot of it is we can get ourselves into this cycle of thinking it's just me. It's got to be me, because I know everyone struggles a bit with the housework, whatever, and I know people struggle a bit with career planning. But the real intersection of the deeper stuff about our relationship, who gets priority, who has the power to decide, I think it can be very isolating, because it's a topic that we just don't talk about a lot. So I think there is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario here, that it's not talked about, so people kind of don't talk about it, but people, when you get them talking, they're very willing to talk about it. I think it's just not a societal norm, and you'll see it. So if you look on the bookshelves of your nearest big bookstore, there's lots of books on work-life balance, and what they really mean is, how do you get all the chores done and have a career? And there's lots of books on career management, but there's just nothing out there on really the intersection of the relationship and our career. And that comes back to the first question, so why did you get in there? And I think that's why there's so much excitement around the book, because it's really the first one that's looking at that intersection on a deeper level, as opposed to the I wouldn't say the simple work-life balance, but those more work-life balance, tactical, transactional things that we've had a lot of data on for a number of years.
Thanks so much to Jennifer for taking the time. And thank you so much, listeners, for exploring our conversation with Jennifer Petriglieri. We hope you found it interesting and valuable to you in your own careers. You will really enjoy her book, so be sure to buy a copy and get reading. You can find a link to the book at www.disrupt-your-career.com. Until next time.